When my grandmother passed away, it fell upon me to sort through her house. She had lived in that old Victorian home for nearly 50 years, and though I'd spent many summers there as a child, it always held an air of mystery. Every creak of the floorboards and every shadow in the corner seemed alive, but I chalked it up to the imagination of youth. Now, as an adult, I was ready to confront the house's secrets, or so I thought. The task was overwhelming. Boxes were piled high in nearly every room, each containing relics of my grandmother's life. Among the family photos, vintage dresses, and stacks of old letters, I found an ornate brass key. It was heavy and cold, with intricate carvings along the bow. I instinctively knew it belonged to the attic. I had never ventured into the attic as a child. My grandmother was adamant that it was no place for little girls. She had always locked the door at the top of the narrow staircase leading up to it. Now, holding the key in my hand, I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. But curiosity won out, as it always does. The attic door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty house. The air was stale, thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. The faint light from a single bulb illuminated rows of old furniture, trunks, and other forgotten treasures. As I stepped inside, something caught my eyeball, sitting on a rocking chair in the far corner. The doll was unlike any I'd ever seen. It was large, nearly the size of a toddler, with porcelain skin that had aged to an unsettling yellowish tint. Its glass eyes were an icy blue, and its curly blonde hair was matted in places, as though it had been handled roughly. It wore a delicate lace dress, now discolored with time. Most disturbing of all was its expression. The doll's lips were parted in a slight smile, but it didn't feel inviting, it felt knowing. I couldn't look away. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to move. When I was close enough, I noticed something even stranger. The doll's name was embroidered on the hem of its dress, Annabelle. My grandmother had never mentioned owning a doll, let alone one so elaborate. I decided to bring it downstairs. It felt absurd leaving it there, staring into the void of the attic. I set it on the mantel in the living room, thinking it would make an interesting antique to keep or sell. That was my first mistake. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint, creaking sounds. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but the noise grew louder, rhythmic, as though someone or something was walking down the hallway. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing. I forced myself to chalk it up to nerves and tried to sleep. The next morning, the doll wasn't on the mantel. I found it in the kitchen, sitting at the table as if waiting for breakfast. I froze. Had I absent-mindedly moved it? No, I was certain I hadn't. I placed it back on the mantel, determined to put it out of my mind. But the incidents escalated. The doll seemed to move on its own, always appearing in different rooms, always facing me no matter where I stood. I heard whispers at night, soft, indecipherable voices that seemed to come from the walls. My dreams were haunted by visions of Annabelle standing at the foot of my bed, her glassy eyes unblinking, her lips curling into that unnerving smile. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of the doll. I placed it in a box and drove to a nearby thrift store, leaving it on the donation counter without a second glance. I felt a wave of relief as I drove away, convinced I had finally rid myself of the curse. But when I returned home, Annabelle was there, sitting on the rocking chair in the attic. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone about the doll. There was no way it could have found its way back on its own. Desperation drove me to search through my grandmother's belongings for answers. I found an old journal hidden in her bedside drawer. The entries were sporadic, but one caught my attention. It described how she had acquired the doll from a traveling vendor who claimed it was unique. Shortly after, strange occurrences began happening in her home, objects moving, unexplained noises and recurring nightmares. My grandmother wrote that she had tried to destroy the doll, but it was protected by something dark. Her last entry read, "Annabelle cannot be destroyed. She is bound to our family. To pass her on is to curse another. I'm sorry." I realized then that Annabelle wasn't just a doll. She was a vessel, a conduit for something malevolent. And now she had chosen me. I spent days researching ways to break the curse, consulting books on the occult, and reaching out to paranormal experts. One medium agreed to help. She performed a cleansing ritual, but as the flames of the sage burned, the doll's glass eyes seemed to glow. The medium screamed, clutching her chest, and collapsed. She survived, but she warned me that Annabelle's power was far greater than she had anticipated. Now, as I sit here writing this, Annabelle is staring at me from across the room. I've tried everything, burning her, burying her, even leaving her miles away, but she always comes back. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. Every night, her whispers grow louder. Every night, her smile seems wider. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Be careful what you inherit. Some family heirlooms are best left untouched. When my husband and I purchased a charming old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, we knew we were in for some hard work. The house had been built in the late 1800s and was filled with squeaky floors, drafty windows, and a cellar that looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Despite its imperfections, we fell in love with its character and decided to make it our forever home. One of the features that sold us was the spacious attic, filled with forgotten relics from the previous owners. On our first evening, while exploring the attic, I stumbled upon a wooden trunk tucked away in a corner. Its brass fittings were tarnished, and the lid creaked loudly as I opened it. Inside, I found an assortment of oddities, yellowed lace dresses, faded photographs, and, resting at the bottom, a doll. The doll was exquisite, yet unsettling. It was made of porcelain, with delicate features painted in remarkable detail. Its eyes of vivid green seemed almost too lifelike. Its hair was jet black, styled in tight curls, and it wore a crimson silk dress adorned with tiny pearls. A name was stitched into the hem of the dress: Isabel. Something about the doll made my skin crawl. Its expression was serene, yet there was an intensity in its gaze that I couldn't ignore. Still, I reasoned it was just an old toy, a relic of someone's childhood, and decided to place it on the mantel in our living room. It seemed a shame to leave such craftsmanship hidden away. That night, the dreams began. I found myself in a vast, empty house, wandering through endless hallways. I could hear faint laughter, childlike and innocent at first, but it grew darker, echoing ominously. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of the laughter still ringing in my ears. The next morning, Isabel was not on the mantel. She was sitting on the rocking chair in the corner of the living room, perfectly poised. I asked my husband if he had moved her, but he denied even noticing the doll. A chill ran through me, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. The following days were riddled with strange occurrences. Doors creaked open on their own, Lights flickered and cold drafts swept through the house despite the summer heat. Isabel seemed to have a way of showing up in unexpected places, on the staircase, at the foot of our bed, even in the kitchen. Each time, her green eyes seemed to be watching, waiting. One evening, I decided to lock her away in the attic. I placed her back in the trunk and secured the lid with rope. I told myself it was silly to be afraid of a doll, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Isabel was somehow aware of what I was doing. That night, I woke to the sound of faint humming. It was coming from the attic. My husband insisted it was just the wind, but I knew better. The next morning, the trunk was open, and Isabel was sitting on the top step of the attic stairs, her head tilted as if mocking me. Desperate for answers, I began researching the history of the house and its previous owners. What I discovered chilled me to the core. Isabel had belonged to the youngest daughter of the family who lived here in the early 1900s. The girl, Mary, had been found dead in the attic under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled that she had been playing with the doll in the days leading up to her death. Determined to rid myself of the doll, I contacted a local historian who specialized in the paranormal. She came to the house, took one look at Isabel, and paled. "This doll carries a dark energy," she said. "It's more than just an object. It's a vessel. The historian recommended burning the doll, but when we tried, the fire wouldn't catch." The flames seemed to recoil from Isabel as if repelled by some unseen force. Next, we tried burying her in the woods behind the house. I thought I could, finally, breathe easy, until she reappeared in the living room the next day, her dress pristine despite the dirt I had covered her with. The historian offered one final solution, a cleansing ritual. She performed it late one night, chanting prayers and surrounding the doll with protective symbols. For a moment, the room felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. But then the symbols began to smudge as if an invisible hand was wiping them away. The historian screamed and fled, leaving us alone with Isabel. The final straw came when my husband, once skeptical, began to hear the laughter too. One night we both woke to find Isabel sitting on our bed, her green eyes gleaming in the dark. We decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We moved out the next day, leaving almost everything behind, including Isabel. I hoped that leaving her there would break the connection, that whatever haunted her would stay bound to the house. But a week later, a package arrived at our new apartment. Inside was Isabel, her crimson dress perfectly pressed, and a note in elegant handwriting, "Welcome home." Now, no matter where we go, Isabel follows. She's a constant presence, her green eyes always watching, her faint laughter haunting our nights. I've come to accept that there's no escaping her. She's a part of our lives now, an uninvited guest we can never evict. If you ever find a doll in an old trunk, leave it there. Some things are best left forgotten. Growing up, my grandmother Margaret owned an antique shop in a small New England town. The shop, Timeless Treasures, was a labyrinth of forgotten heirlooms, weathered furniture, and dusty trinkets. But among the shelves and cabinets, one item stood out, a porcelain doll displayed prominently in the front window. The doll had golden curls, painted blue eyes that seemed to follow you, and a dress made of delicate lace. It was immaculate, as if untouched by time. Despite the doll's beauty, it unnerved me. Whenever I visited the shop as a child, I felt its gaze bore into me, cold and relentless. The doll was known as Lila. According to my grandmother, she had acquired it from an estate sale decades ago. The doll's previous owner, a woman named Eloise Harper, had died under strange circumstances. Eloise was a recluse, and when her body was discovered in her home, Lila was found seated on her lap, eerily pristine amidst the decay. Though my grandmother had received numerous offers to buy Lila, she refused to sell her. "She's not for sale," Grandma would say, her tone resolute. When I asked why, she would only mutter, "Some things should not be passed along." As I grew older, I stopped visiting the shop as often, but Lila remained in the back of my mind. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, I inherited timeless treasures. It was bittersweet walking into the shop again. Everything was just as she had left it, including Lila, still sitting in the front window, her glassy eyes fixed on the street. I decided to sell the shop. I had no interest in antiques and wanted to move on from the past. Before listing the property, I began organizing the inventory, cataloging items for auction. When I reached the front window, I hesitated. For years, I had avoided looking directly at Lila, but now I had no choice. As I reached for the doll, a shiver ran down my spine. Her porcelain skin was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. I placed her on the counter, telling myself she was just a doll, nothing more. Yet, as the day wore on, I felt a growing unease. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the shop, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. That night, I stayed late to finish the inventory. The shop was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock. Around midnight, I heard Ita's soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the front window. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I approached the window. Lila was back in her usual spot, though I was certain I had left her on the counter. Her hand was pressed against the glass, as if she had been trying to escape or call someone inside. I told myself it was my imagination, but the unease lingered. I decided to move Lila to the back storage room, away from sight. As I carried her through the shop, I swore I felt her weight shift in my hands, as if she were resisting. I locked her in a cabinet and returned to the front, determined to finish my work. But the tapping resumed, louder this time, accompanied by a faint giggle. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room. The cabinet door was ajar, though I had locked it. Lila was gone. I found her seated at the top of the stairs leading to the basement, her head tilted, her painted lips curled into a faint smile. Panic set in. I grabbed the doll and stuffed her into a storage box, sealing it shut with tape. I left the shop, locking the door behind me, and vowed not to return until morning. That night, I dreamt of Eloise Harper. She stood in her decrepit house, cradling Lila in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she whispered over and over, "She's mine. She'll always be mine. Growing up, my grandmother Margaret owned an antique shop in a small New England town. The shop, Timeless Treasures, was a labyrinth of forgotten heirlooms, weathered furniture, and dusty trinkets. But among the shelves and cabinets, one item stood out, a porcelain doll displayed prominently in the front window. The doll had golden curls, painted blue eyes that seemed to follow you, and a dress made of delicate lace. It was immaculate, as if untouched by time. Despite the doll's beauty, it unnerved me. Whenever I visited the shop as a child, I felt its gaze bore into me, cold and relentless. The doll was known as Lila. According to my grandmother, she had acquired it from an estate sale decades ago. The doll's previous owner, a woman named Eloise Harper, had died under strange circumstances. Eloise was a recluse, and when her body was discovered in her home, Lila was found seated on her lap, eerily pristine amidst the decay. Though my grandmother had received numerous offers to buy Lila, she refused to sell her. "She's not for sale," Grandma would say, her tone resolute. When I asked why, she would only mutter, "Some things should not be passed along." As I grew older, I stopped visiting the shop as often, but Lila remained in the back of my mind. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, I inherited timeless treasures. It was bittersweet walking into the shop again. Everything was just as she had left it, including Lila, still sitting in the front window, her glassy eyes fixed on the street. I decided to sell the shop. I had no interest in antiques and wanted to move on from the past. Before listing the property, I began organizing the inventory, cataloging items for auction. When I reached the front window, I hesitated. For years, I had avoided looking directly at Lila, but now I had no choice. As I reached for the doll, a shiver ran down my spine. Her porcelain skin was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. I placed her on the counter, telling myself she was just a doll, nothing more. Yet, as the day wore on, I felt a growing unease. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the shop, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. That night, I stayed late to finish the inventory. The shop was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock. Around midnight, I heard Ita's soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the front window. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I approached the window. Lila was back in her usual spot, though I was certain I had left her on the counter. Her hand was pressed against the glass, as if she had been trying to escape or call someone inside. I told myself it was my imagination, but the unease lingered. I decided to move Lila to the back storage room, away from sight. As I carried her through the shop, I swore I felt her weight shift in my hands, as if she were resisting. I locked her in a cabinet and returned to the front, determined to finish my work. But the tapping resumed, louder this time, accompanied by a faint giggle. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room. The cabinet door was ajar, though I had locked it. Lila was gone. I found her seated at the top of the stairs leading to the basement, her head tilted, her painted lips curled into a faint smile. Panic set in. I grabbed the doll and stuffed her into a storage box, sealing it shut with tape. I left the shop, locking the door behind me, and vowed not to return until morning. That night, I dreamt of Eloise Harper. She stood in her decrepit house, cradling Lila in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she whispered over and over, "She's mine. She'll always be mine. She'll always..." It all started when I inherited my Uncle Raymond's estate. A renowned collector of rare and peculiar artifacts, his sprawling home was more of a museum than a house. He had spent decades scouring the globe, amassing items that told whispered tales of the uncanny and the cursed. When I stepped into his house for the first time after his passing, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the New England winter. The grand foyer was lined with towering shelves, each filled with objects that seemed to stare back at me, ancient masks, ceremonial daggers, preserved insects in glass cases. But what caught my eye immediately was a room at the far end of the hall, sealed behind a heavy oak door. On the door was a brass plaque that read, Private collection do not enter. I should have heeded the warning, but curiosity got the better of me. With the keys my uncle had left behind, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and the air felt thick, oppressive. The walls were lined with glass display cases, each housing a single item. At the center of the room, sitting on a pedestal beneath a glass dome, was a doll. The doll was striking, almost unnaturally so. She had jet-black hair tied in perfect curls, pale porcelain skin, and a crimson dress that looked as if it had been sewn yesterday. Her eyes were unlike any I had ever seen, large, vivid, and almost alive. A small plaque beneath the dome read, "Annika." I felt an immediate unease as I stared at the doll. Her gaze seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. Shaking off the feeling, I closed the door and left the room, deciding to focus on sorting the rest of the house. For days I worked on cataloguing Uncle Raymond's collection, preparing to sell the house and its contents. But no matter where I was in the house, I felt watched. At night, the sensation grew stronger. I began hearing faint noises, soft giggles, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric. Every time I checked, the house was empty. One evening, I found the courage to return to the private collection room. I wanted to prove to myself that the doll was just an ordinary object. When I opened the door, I froze. Annika's glass dome was shattered, and the doll was gone. Panic surged through me. I searched the entire house, but there was no sign of her. I tried to convince myself that someone must have broken in, though the locks and windows were undisturbed. That night, I barely slept, clutching a baseball bat, as I lay in bed. The next morning, I found Annika sitting at the kitchen table. Her dress was pristine, and her lifelike eyes seemed to glimmer with malice. My hands trembled as I picked her up and carried her back to the private collection room. I placed her on the pedestal and locked the door, determined to leave the house as soon as possible. But Annika didn't stay in the room. Over the next few days, I found her in different parts of the house, on the staircase, in the study, even on my bed. Each time she seemed closer, her painted smile more sinister. I began hearing whispers in the night, a child's voice singing a lullaby I didn't recognize. The line between dreams and reality blurred, and I started questioning my sanity. Desperate, I called a friend, Mia, who was a historian with an interest in the occult. When she arrived, I showed her the doll. She paled instantly, her usual composure replaced with fear. "This isn't just a doll," she said. "It's a vessel." Mia explained that certain objects could act as conduits for spirits or darker entities. Annika, she believed, was bound to something malevolent, and Uncle Raymond must have known. "We need to destroy it," Mia said. That night, we built a fire in the backyard, intending to burn Annika. As the flames roared, I held the doll over the fire. But the moment I lowered her, the fire extinguished itself, leaving us in complete darkness. A cold wind swept through the yard, and Annika's laugh echoed all around us. "Panicked," Mia suggested, a cleansing ritual she had learned during her studies. We prepared the ritual in the private collection room, lighting candles and reciting an incantation meant to banish the spirit. As we chanted, the room grew colder, and the walls seemed to tremble. Annika began to move. Her tiny porcelain fingers twitched, and her head turned toward us. Her eyes glowed a deep red, and a voice, deep and guttural, emerged from her. "You cannot banish me. I am eternal." The candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard Mia scream, followed by the sound of shattering glass. When the lights flickered back on, Mia was unconscious on the floor, and Annika was back on her pedestal, her painted smile wider than before. Mia recovered, but refused to return to the house. She begged me to leave, but I felt trapped. Annika wouldn't let me go. Every attempt to sell the house, failed buyers would back out without explanation, and realtors claimed they felt uneasy just stepping inside. I eventually stopped trying. I live here now, surrounded by my uncle's collection, a reluctant guardian of his secrets. Annika still moves around, her presence a constant reminder that some things are better left undiscovered. At night, I hear her whispers, her giggles, and the soft patter of her tiny porcelain feet. I've come to accept that she is always watching, waiting, and I know deep down that one day she'll stop waiting. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited something unexpected, a handcrafted, intricately detailed dollhouse. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, complete with tiny furniture, miniature paintings, and even functional little lights. But what stood out the most were the dolls, a family of 5 made of porcelain, each with remarkably human features. I wasn't particularly close to my grandmother, so I didn't have sentimental attachment to the dollhouse, but my daughter, Clara, was enchanted by it. At 8 years old, she had a love for tiny things, tea sets, figurines, and now this dollhouse. I couldn't deny her joy, so I set it up in her room, arranging the furniture and placing the familist of dolls in their miniature living room. At first, everything seemed fine. Clara would spend hours sitting cross-legged in front of the dollhouse, her little fingers delicately moving furniture around and arranging the dolls. "This is Mr. Theodore," she said, holding up the father doll. "He works a lot, but always has time for tea. And this is Mrs. Lillian. She likes to bake cookies." I smiled at her imagination. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed something strange. I was walking past her room late at night when I heard Clara talking softly. The light beneath her door indicated she was still awake, even though it was past her bedtime. I opened the door and found her sitting in front of the dollhouse, whispering. "Clara, who are you talking to?" I asked. She turned to me with a wide grin. "The family, Mommy. They like it when I tell them stories." It was odd, but I brushed it off as childhood imagination. Over the next few days, Clara's attachment to the dollhouse grew. She refused to let me move it, even for cleaning, and the whispers became a nightly occurrence. One night, I decided to listen in. I cracked the door open and heard Clara saying, "No, Mrs. Lillian, I can't stay up that late. Mommy would be mad." There was silence, as if she was waiting for a response. Then she giggled. "Okay, just one more story." A chill ran down my spine. I confronted Clara the next morning. "Sweetheart, when you talk to the dolls, do they talk back?" She hesitated, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Not like you and me, but they tell me things in my head." I felt an unease I couldn't explain. I decided to inspect the dollhouse while Clara was at school. As I moved the dolls, a strange sensation overcame me, like I was being watched. Their porcelain faces, though unmoving, seemed too lifelike. I flipped over Mr. Theodore's doll and found a strange marking carved into the base, a symbol I didn't recognize. That night, Clara woke up screaming. I ran into her room to find her trembling, pointing at the dollhouse. "They were moving, Mommy! They were moving!" I glanced at the dollhouse. The dolls were arranged differently than they had been before bedtime. The father doll was now in the kitchen, holding a tiny knife. The mother doll was upstairs, standing by the bed. My rational mind tried to find a logical explanation, but my instincts screamed something was wrong. The next day, I called a local historian who specialized in antiques, showing him pictures of the dollhouse and the marking on the doll. His expression darkened. "This isn't just a toy," he said. "That symbol, it's linked to old folklore about trapped spirits. The dolls might be more than they appear." He suggested I get rid of the dollhouse immediately, but when I told Clara, she cried and begged me not to. "They'll be angry, Mommy. They said we're their new family." That night, I decided to end it once and for all. While Clara was asleep, I carried the dollhouse to the backyard. I doused it in lighter fluid and struck a match. As the flames consumed it, a horrible shriek echoed through the air, a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. The fire roared unnaturally high before dying out, leaving behind only ashes. I thought it was over. But when I returned to Clara's room, the dollhouse was there, completely intact, with the dolls seated in their original positions. Clara was sitting in front of it, smiling up at me. "I told you, Mummy, they don't want to leave." Since then, the dollhouse has remained in our home. Clara insists it must stay, and every attempt to remove it ends the same: it reappears the next morning, untouched. The dolls seem more lifelike with each passing day, and sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see them move. I no longer hear Clara whispering to them at night. Now she laughs. But it's not the innocent laugh of my little girl. It's something darker, something that no longer belongs to her. And deep down, I know the family in the dollhouse has grown by one. It started with an impulse buy at an estate sale. I wasn't even supposed to be there. I had only stopped by to keep my best friend Marcy company. She had a knack for finding quirky antiques, and I enjoyed tagging along for the free coffee and gossip. But that day, as we browsed through the dusty treasures of a sprawling Victorian home, something caught my eye: a porcelain doll displayed in a glass case. Her delicate face was painted with exquisite detail, her lips slightly parted as though she might speak. She wore a deep crimson dress trimmed with lace, and her glassy blue eyes seemed almost alive. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to her. The tag read $40, and without thinking, I bought her. Marcy teased me about it all the way home. "You're the last person I'd expect to buy a doll, Kate. What's next, a tea set?" "I don't know," I admitted. It just felt special. When I got home, I placed the doll on the mantel above my fireplace. My apartment was modern and minimalistic, so the doll looked out of place, but I didn't mind. I even gave her a name, Annabelle. It felt right, though I had no idea why. The first few days were uneventful. I'd glance at Annabelle now and then, feeling a strange comfort in her presence. But then small things started happening. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the coffee table. Doors I swore I had closed would be slightly ajar. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. But one night, as I was watching TV, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the mantel. I turned to look at Annabelle. She was still sitting there, her tiny hands resting on her lap, but her head was tilted slightly to the side as though she were listening. My breath caught in my throat. I convinced myself it was my imagination, turned off the TV and went to bed. That night, I dreamed of the estate sale. Only this time, the house was empty except for the doll. She stood, life-sized, in the center of the room. Her eyes followed me as I moved, and when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. Her porcelain, lips moved but no sound came out. I woke up drenched in sweat. The next morning, I decided to move Annabelle to a shelf in my bedroom closet. I told myself I wasn't scared, just rearranging. But the unease lingered. That night, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the closet. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob, before finally opening it. Annabelle was sitting on the floor, staring up at me with those unblinking eyes. I screamed, slamming the door shut. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping the lights on and clutching a baseball bat. The next morning, I packed the doll in a box and took her to a thrift store on the other side of town. I felt a wave of relief as I drove away, sure the ordeal was over. It wasn't. When I got home, the box was sitting on my doorstep. Annabelle was inside, her crimson dress as pristine as ever. A note was tucked beside her, written in an elegant script. "You are hers now." I didn't know what to do. I called Marcy, desperate for advice. When she arrived and saw the doll, she went pale. "Kate, where did you get this?" I explained about the estate sale. Marcy shook her head. That house belonged to a woman named Eleanor Barnes. She was obsessed with dolls and supposedly used them to trap the spirits of people she hated. After she died, the house sat empty for years. No one wanted to touch her collection. I felt sick. "So what does that mean? What do I do?" Marcy suggested we burn the doll. That night, we built a fire in the backyard. As the flames engulfed Annabelle, a piercing scream filled the air. It wasn't human, it was something primal, something otherworldly. The fire roared, higher than it should have, then abruptly died out. The doll was gone, reduced to ashes. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. But the peace didn't last. A week later, I woke up to find a small, hand-stitched doll on my pillow. It wasn't Annabelle, but it had the same lifelike eyes, the same crimson dress. A new note was pinned to its chest. "You can't get rid of her. She chose you." Now, every night, I hear tapping. The doll moves from room to room, always watching, always waiting. I don't know what she wants, but I know one thing: this isn't over, and I don't think it ever will be. I never liked dolls. They always unnerved me with their frozen smiles and glassy eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. So when I inherited my late great-uncle's house, I wasn't thrilled to discover that one of his passions had been collecting them. The house was an aging Victorian, the kind that looked as though it belonged in a horror movie. I hadn't even known Uncle Leonard that well. He was a distant relative who kept to himself, living in the same house for over 60 years until his passing. When I stepped inside for the first time, the air was heavy with dust and an overwhelming sense of stillness. The dolls were everywhere, perched on shelves, tucked into cabinets, and even arranged neatly on chairs. Each one was unique, crafted with an unsettling level of detail. Some had cherubic faces with rosy cheeks, while others looked almost human, with expressions so lifelike they seemed to breathe. I planned to sell the house as soon as possible, but first I had to clean it out. The dolls were at the top of my list. I started gathering them into boxes, careful not to look too closely at their faces. It felt as though their tiny eyes were accusing me of something. Then I found the workshop. It was tucked away in the basement, behind a heavy wooden door that creaked ominously when I opened it. The room was filled with tools, paints, brushes, and rows upon rows of doll parts. Arms, legs, head was like stepping into a macabre assembly line. In the center of the room was a single finished doll, sitting in a high-backed chair. This doll was unlike the others. She had jet-black hair that cascaded in soft curls, and her eyes were a piercing green that seemed almost alive. Her dress was made of delicate white lace, and her porcelain hands were folded neatly in her lap. There was a note beside her, written in my uncle's shaky handwriting. "To my masterpiece, Evelyn, protector." I didn't think much of it at the time. The doll was creepy, sure, but no more so than the others. I left her in the chair and went back upstairs, deciding I'd tackle the basement another day. That night I heard footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The house was old, and old houses creak, right? But as I lay in bed, the sound grew louder. Slow, deliberate steps moving down the hallway outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching the bedside lamp like a weapon. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then the door creaked open. There was no one there. I barely slept that night, and in the morning I resolved to get rid of the dolls as quickly as possible. I loaded box after box into my car and drove to a local antique shop. The owner, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, refused to take them. "These aren't ordinary dolls," she said, examining one with a frown. "They're bound." "Bound?" I asked, confused. "Bound spirits. Whoever made these didn't just craft dolls, they trapped souls." I laughed nervously, but she didn't smile. "Take them to a church," she said, "or burn them, but whatever you do, don't keep them." I didn't believe her, of course, but her words stayed with me as I drove back to the house. When I arrived, I froze. Evelyn was sitting on the front porch. I hadn't moved her from the basement. My stomach churned as I picked her up, her green eyes seeming to sparkle with malice. I carried her inside and placed her in a closet, locking the door. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by whispers. Faint, almost inaudible, but distinctly there. I could make out a single word repeated over and over. Evelyn. The next morning, I tried to throw her away. I drove to the nearest dumpster, tossed her inside, and sped off. But when I got home, she was sitting on the mantel above the fireplace, her porcelain face turned slightly toward me. Desperation took hold. I called a local priest, Father Jerome, and explained everything. He agreed to come by and perform a blessing. When he arrived, he seemed unnerved by the house and the doll. As he began the blessing, the room grew colder. The lights flickered, and an oppressive weight seemed to fill the air. Evelyn's green eyes glinted in the dim light, and then she moved. It was subtle, a slight tilt of her head, but we both saw it. Father Jerome shouted a prayer, splashing holy water on the doll. She screamed. It wasn't a sound a doll should make. It was a human scream, filled with rage and anguish. The doll shattered, pieces of porcelain flying across the room. But the relief was short-lived. The house trembled, and a shadowy figure appeared in the corner. It was a woman, her face twisted with anger. "You've destroyed my vessel," she hissed. "Now you'll pay." Father Jerome finished the blessing, and the shadow vanished, but the damage was done. I sold the house the next day, leaving everything behind. I thought I was free. But last week, I found a doll on my doorstep. She had jet black hair and piercing green eyes. A note was pinned to her dress. "You can't run from me." Now every night I hear footsteps, and I know she's coming. When I inherited my grandmother's old farmhouse, I didn't expect the place to be filled with memories and relics of a bygone era. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest, the house had stood for over a century, weathering storms and time itself. Despite its charm, it had an aura of melancholy, amplified by the fact that my grandmother had spent her last years there alone. My goal was to renovate the house and make it livable again. While clearing out the attic, I found a dusty trunk tucked in the corner. It was locked, but the key was taped to the lid. Curious, I opened it, only to discover an assortment of old photos, yellowing letters, and a single porcelain doll wrapped in faded cloth. The doll was peculiar. It had a delicate face with painted features, though the right side of its mouth was cracked, giving it an unsettlingly lopsided smile. Its glass eyes seemed dull, but they captured the light in a way that made them appear alive. A tag around its neck read, "Matilda." I wasn't one for dolls, but something about Matilda intrigued me. Perhaps it was her craftsmanship or the strange sense of familiarity she evoked. I placed her on a shelf in the living room, thinking she'd add a vintage charm to the otherwise empty space. That night, I began to hear faint sounds. At first, it was subtle. A creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of fabric. I dismissed it as the house settling, but as the hours stretched on, the noises grew more distinct. It sounded like soft footsteps pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. When I finally mustered the courage to check, the hallway was empty. I laughed it off, blaming my overactive imagination, and went back to bed. The next day, while repainting the kitchen, I noticed Matilda had shifted positions. I distinctly remembered placing her upright on the shelf, yet now she was leaning forward, her cracked smile facing the window. I brushed it off as an accident and adjusted her position. As the sun set, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew heavier, and the faint scent of lavender, the kind my grandmother used to, wafted through the rooms. I chalked it up to leftover memories, but a nagging unease lingered. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They moved through the house, stopping outside my bedroom door once again. This time, they didn't fade. Instead, I heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The giggle stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. My heart raced as I locked the door and turned on every light in the room. Sleep was impossible, and I spent the night clutching a flashlight, jumping at every sound. By morning, I decided to get rid of Matilda. I packed her into a box and drove to a local thrift store. The clerk gave me a strange look when I handed her over, but I didn't stick around to explain. I felt a surge of relief as I drove away, certain that the nightmare was over. But when I returned home, Matilda was sitting on the shelf, her cracked smile wider than before. Panic set in. I called my friend Claire, who had always been skeptical of anything paranormal. She agreed to come over, armed with sage and her grandmother's old book of prayers. Together we tried to cleanse the house. As Claire chanted prayers and burned the sage, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Matilda's eyes seemed to glow faintly, and the smell of lavender intensified. The lights flickered, and a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. "You cannot banish me!" The doll fell from the shelf, landing face down on the floor. We stared at it, unsure of what to do next. Claire picked it up gingerly, her face pale. "This isn't just a doll," she whispered. "It's a vessel." Desperate, we decided to burn it. We drove to an open field and built a small fire. As the flames consumed Matilda, an ear-piercing scream filled the air. The fire roared unnaturally high, and a dark shadow emerged from the smoke, darting into the nearby woods. We stood there, shaken and unsure of what had just happened. Claire muttered a final prayer, and we left the field in silence. For weeks, I thought it was over. The house felt lighter, and the strange occurrences stopped. But one evening, while cleaning out another room, I found a small, hand-carved music box. When I opened it, the haunting melody of a lullaby played. Inside was a single tag that read, "For Matilda." And just like that, the footsteps returned. I had always loved antique stores, their musty smell, the hidden treasures buried under years of dust, and the stories every object seemed to whisper. So when I stumbled upon an old shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of town, I couldn't resist exploring. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crowded with trinkets and relics from decades past. As I wandered, my eyes fell on a doll in a glass case at the back of the store. She was exquisite, her porcelain face painted with lifelike detail, framed by golden curls. Her dress was made of fine lace, though it was yellowed with age. But what truly drew me in were her eyes, glassy and pale green, as though they held secrets, waiting to be told. The shopkeeper, a frail man with sunken eyes and a voice like rustling paper, noticed my interest. "Ah, you've found her," he said. "Who is she?" I asked, already feeling uneasy. "She was crafted by a doll maker over a century ago," he began. "Legend has it, the doll was meant to house the spirit of his deceased daughter. He poured his grief into his work, and when it was done, the doll was so lifelike, it was as though she had been brought back to him." I laughed nervously. "That's quite the story." The shopkeeper's expression remained solemn. He called her Lila, but grief twists the soul. The doll became something more than he intended, something far darker. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to buy her. The shopkeeper hesitated before handing her over, warning me to keep her in a room where she could see outside. "She gets restless," he said. It was ridiculous, of course. I didn't believe in curses or haunted objects. Lila was just a beautiful antique, a piece of history I wanted to preserve. I placed her on a shelf in my living room, next to the window where the sunlight could illuminate her features. That night I awoke to the sound of faint humming. It was soft, melodic, and undeniably coming from downstairs. My chest tightened as I grabbed my phone and crept toward the staircase. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The humming stopped. I convinced myself I had imagined it and returned to bed, but sleep was impossible. The next morning, I found Lila on the floor, her head tilted as though she had been looking out the window. I told myself I must have bumped the shelf without realizing it. But as the days passed, things escalated. Objects moved inexplicably, shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and always that soft, haunting humming in the dead of night. One evening, I came home to find a trail of tiny footprints in the dust leading from the shelf to the window. My heart pounded as I stared at the doll. Her glassy eyes seemed brighter, more alive. Desperate for answers, I returned to the antique shop, but it was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. I tried researching the doll maker and his supposed curse, but found nothing concrete. That night, the humming grew louder. It wasn't coming from downstairs this time. It was right outside my bedroom door. My hands trembled as I turned the lock. "Lila," I whispered, "what do you want?" The humming stopped. Then, in a voice as soft as a child's, I heard, "You." The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. The door creaked open on its own, revealing Lila sitting on the floor, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, grabbing her and throwing her into the closet. But as I tried to catch my breath, I heard the faint sound of footsteps moving across the floor. When I turned, she was back on the shelf, her cracked lips curved into the faintest smile. I decided to destroy her. I drove to a remote field, doused her in lighter fluid, and set her ablaze. The flames roared to life, but as her porcelain face cracked and blackened, I swore I heard her laughing. I returned home, exhausted but relieved. The house was quiet that night, and for the first time in weeks I slept peacefully. But when I woke the next morning, she was sitting on the windowsill, her eyes brighter than ever. "You can't get rid of me," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. Now, as I write this, I hear the humming again. It's closer this time, more insistent. Lila's glassy eyes follow me everywhere I go. I don't know what she wants, but I know she won't stop until she gets it. When I first saw the doll, it was nestled in the corner of a dusty shelf at a small thrift store on the outskirts of town. Its porcelain face was cracked but delicate, with hauntingly lifelike blue eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where. I stood. The store owner, an elderly woman with a hunched back and piercing gaze, noticed my interest. "That doll," she rasped, "isn't for the faint of heart. It has a history." Her words should have deterred me, but instead they piqued my curiosity. I was a collector of oddities, and this doll, with its tattered Victorian dress and a veil of mystery, felt like a perfect addition to my collection. Despite her cryptic warning, I purchased it for a modest price and brought it home. I placed the doll on a shelf in my study, where it seemed to fit perfectly amongst my other collectibles. For the first few days, everything seemed normal until the whispers began. It started subtly, like the rustle of leaves outside my window. I would be working late at night, the house silent, and hear faint murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination or the creaks of my old house. But then the whispers grew louder. One night, while organizing some papers, I distinctly heard my name. Amelia. I froze, the pen in my hand slipping to the floor. My eyes darted to the doll, its glassy gaze fixed on me. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion, playing tricks on me. I went to bed early that night, determined to shake off the unease. The following morning, I woke to find the doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf, but sitting upright on my desk, its hands delicately clasped together, as if it had been placed there intentionally. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps I had moved it and forgotten, or maybe my cat had knocked it over. But the whispers continued, growing more insistent and distinct. They weren't just random noises, they were words, please, for help. "Amelia, free me, please." I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with this doll, and I needed answers. I returned to the thrift store, clutching the doll tightly in my arms. The elderly shopkeeper wasn't surprised to see me.
"I told you it wasn't for the faint of heart," she said, her voice filled with both pity and resignation. "What is this?" I demanded, holding up the doll. "What's wrong with it?" She sighed deeply and began to tell me the story. The doll
Had belonged to a young girl named Lillian who had lived in the late 1800s. Lillian had been the daughter of a wealthy family, but her life had been anything but charmed. She had been tragically murdered at the age of 10, and her spirit was said to have attached itself to the doll she loved most. The shopkeeper explained that Lillian's spirit was restless, trapped within the porcelain confines of the doll, seeking someone who could help her find peace. "How do I help her?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "You must uncover the truth about her death," she replied. "Only then can her spirit be set free." Determined to end the torment, I dove into research. I combed through old newspapers, archives and family records. It wasn't easy, but I eventually pieced together the tragic tale of Lillian's life and death. She had been poisoned by a jealous governess who had been envious of the child's inheritance. The governess had been arrested but died in prison before revealing where she had hidden the girl's body. With this knowledge, I returned home and confronted the doll. I spoke aloud, telling Lillian everything I had learned and promising to help her rest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, until they abruptly stopped. That night, I had a vivid dream. In it, a little girl with golden curls and a white dress smiled at me. "Thank you," she said, before fading into a warm, golden light. When I woke, the doll was gone. In its place was a small note, written in delicate handwriting. "I'm free now. Thank you." Though I never saw the doll again, I sometimes feel a gentle presence in my home, as if Lillian is watching over me, grateful for the peace she was finally granted. My fascination with dolls started when I was a child, but it was never about their beauty. I saw them as windows to another time, with stories etched into their painted smiles and glassy eyes. So, when I came across an estate sale advertisement featuring an antique doll described as one of a kind, I couldn't resist. The estate belonged to the late Miss Margaret Winthrop, a reclusive woman rumoured to have been eccentric in life and mysterious in death. Among her possessions was a doll unlike any I'd ever seen. It stood nearly 2 feet tall, its porcelain face exquisitely detailed, framed by jet-black curls. Its eyes were an unsettling shade of grey, almost too lifelike, and it wore a faded crimson dress with tiny embroidered roses. A small plaque at its base read, "Isabel, 1872. As I handed over the money, the estate's caretaker gave me a peculiar look. "Be careful with that one," she said, her voice low and hesitant. Miss Margaret always claimed it had a mind of its own. I laughed nervously, brushing off her words. Stories like that were common with old, valuable items. People liked to add a touch of mystery to justify their worth. I placed Isabel carefully in my car and drove home, excited to add her to my collection. From the moment I brought Isabel into my house, the atmosphere changed. At first, it was subtle. The room where I displayed her felt colder, even when the heating was on. My cat, Luna, who loved to curl up in my collection room, refused to enter. She hissed at the doorway, her fur bristling, and ran away. I attributed it to the unfamiliar scent of the antique. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint sound. It was soft, like the tap of fingers on glass. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing, a branch against the window perhaps. The following days brought stranger occurrences. Objects in my collection room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Isabel's position on her shelf changed ever so slightly. One morning, I found her head tilted to the side as if she were listening to something. I corrected it, chalking it up to vibrations from the floorboards or my imagination. But then, the dreams began. In these dreams, I was a child again, wandering through a grand Victorian mansion. Isabel was there, sitting on a chaise lounge, her grey eyes fixed on me. She never moved, but I felt her presence like a shadow that stretched across the room. The dreams always ended the same way. Isabel's porcelain hand would reach out to me, and I'd wake up gasping for air. After a particularly vivid dream, I decided to investigate Isabel's history. The plaque on her base had been a clue. 1872 was a start. I spent hours online searching for dolls of her make and style. Eventually, I found an obscure forum dedicated to antique dolls. Someone had posted about a doll that sounded eerily similar to Isabel. They claimed it was cursed, tied to a tragic event. The post mentioned a young girl named Isabel Morton, who had lived in England in the 1870s. She had died under mysterious circumstances, and the doll had been crafted in her likeness as a memorial by her grieving mother. Rumor had it that Isabel's spirit had latched onto the doll, unable to move on. I felt a chill as I read the final lines of the post. The doll brings grief to anyone who keeps her too long. If you hear her whisper, it's already too late. I couldn't ignore the unease any longer. That night, I locked Isabel in a cabinet, determined to create some distance. But as I tried to sleep, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with every passing minute. "Let me out," a childlike voice pleaded. "Please, I'm so lonely." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was coming from the collection room. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the door. The whispers stopped as soon as I touched the handle. Inside, the cabinet was wide open. Isabel sat on the floor, her grey eyes staring up at me. Her delicate porcelain lips were parted ever so slightly, as if she were about to speak. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't keep her, not after this. The next morning, I packed Isabel up and drove back to the estate sales location. The caretaker wasn't there, and the house was locked up tight. With no other options, I left the doll on the front porch, wrapped in an old blanket. As I drove away, I felt a weight
lift from my chest. For the first time in days, the air in my car felt warm and light.
But as I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing on the porch. A little girl in a crimson dress, her grey eyes watching me leave. I never returned to that house, and I never bought another doll. Isabel taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Some stories are better left untold, and some companions are better left behind. I've always had a fascination for old toys, especially dolls. To me, they represent tiny fragments of the past, frozen in time. My collection started modestly, porcelain dolls from thrift shops, handmade ones from small-town markets. But my obsession grew, and soon I was scouring estate sales and antique shops, always on the hunt for the rarest finds. It was at an estate sale in a remote part of New England that I found her. The auctioneer described her as a unique historical artifact, and she certainly looked the part. The doll was about 20 inches tall, with auburn hair made of real human strands, a hand-painted face that was disturbingly realistic, and a dress of faded lavender silk that screamed Victorian elegance. What stood out the most were her eyes, two pale green orbs that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. "She's been with the family for generations," the auctioneer said, his tone almost reverent. The original owner called her Rose. Legend has it she's brought both fortune and tragedy to those who've kept her. It was the kind of sales pitch that would send most people running, but to me, it was like a siren song. A doll with a backstory? That was exactly the kind of piece I wanted. I placed a bid and won her for far less than I expected, as if no one else wanted her. As I carried her to my car, an elderly woman who had been at the sale stopped me. "You
Should leave her," she said, her voice trembling. "Rose is not a doll, she's a prison."
I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was just one of those people who like to add drama to old things. I thanked her and drove off, the doll secured in the passenger seat. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, but I dismissed it as nerves. When I got home, I placed Rose in the center of my collection room, giving her a spot of honor. Her presence was imposing, and I couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. But as the days passed, I began to notice small, unsettling things. At first, it was her position. I was meticulous about how I arranged my dolls, but Rose seemed to shift slightly whenever I wasn't looking. Her head would tilt differently, or her hands would be in a position I didn't remember arranging. I blamed my own forgetfulness. Then came the footsteps. Late at night, when the house was silent, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from the collection room. Soft and deliberate, as if someone small was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house, settling. But deep down, I knew better. One night, I woke up to the feeling of being watched. My bedroom door was open, something I never did, and in the faint glow of the hallway light, I saw her. Rose was standing in the doorway, her pale green eyes reflecting the light like a cat's. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She just stood there, staring at me. When I finally mustered the courage to turn on the bedside lamp, she was gone. I ran to the collection room, and there she was, back on her shelf, her head tilted in that unnerving way. I told myself it had to be a nightmare, but it felt too real. The next day, I decided to do some research. I contacted the auctioneer, who reluctantly gave me the name of the estate's previous owner, a man named Henry Caldwell. After some digging, I found out he had passed away under mysterious circumstances. His death certificate listed a heart attack, but neighbors claimed they'd heard him screaming in his house the night he died. I also found an old newspaper article about the Caldwell family. It mentioned Rose briefly, describing her as a doll created by a grieving mother after the death of her daughter. But there was more a rumor that the daughter's soul had been bound to the doll through some kind of ritual. The mother had been accused of witchcraft and died under suspicious circumstances herself. The more I read, the more I realized I needed to get rid of Rose. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I tried to move her, something stopped me. I'd feel a wave of nausea, or my hands would shake uncontrollably. It was as if she was anchoring herself to the room and to me. One night, as I was trying to figure out what to do, the lights in my house went out. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the collection room, dreading what I might find. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. Rose was gone from her shelf. The footsteps started again, louder this time, echoing through the house. They weren't just pacing, they were coming toward me. I turned around and saw her standing at the end of the hallway, her green eyes glowing in the dark. "Why won't you love me?" a small, broken voice whispered. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. When I picked it up and shone it down the hall, she was gone. The next morning, I packed Rose in a box and drove to the nearest river. I weighed the box down with stones and threw it in, watching as it sank beneath the water. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, as if I'd just committed some unspeakable act. For weeks I slept with the lights on, expecting to see her at any moment, but she never came back. My collection room felt lighter, warmer, as if a shadow had lifted. I've since stopped collecting dolls. Every so often I'll see one in a store window or at an estate sale and I'll feel that old temptation. But then I'll remember Rose and the way her green eyes followed me, and I'll walk away. Some things are meant to stay in the past. My husband Daniel and I had just moved into our dream house, a Victorian-style home with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and just enough character to feel unique. The price had been suspiciously low, but the realtor chalked it up to the property's age and the need for minor repairs. We were too charmed by its beauty to care. The attic was one of the first things that caught my eye. It was spacious, with slanted ceilings and a single circular window overlooking the front yard. It was perfect for storage, but I had other. Planzen Art Studio. I'd spent years dreaming of a space to paint, and the attic seemed ideal. During our second week in the house, as we unpacked the last of our boxes, I decided to clean out the attic. That's when I found the doll. She was sitting on a small rocking chair in the corner, partially covered by a sheet. Her dress was faded blue satin, her porcelain face marred by a faint crack running down one cheek. Her eyes, glassy and deep brown, seemed too lifelike. She was beautiful in a haunting way. Daniel found me holding her when he came up to check on me. "That's creepy," he said, wrinkling his nose. "Are you seriously keeping that thing?" I
laughed, trying to dismiss the unease that crept up my spine. "Why not? She's part of the house's charm." We named her Clara, partly as a joke and partly to make her seem less unnerving. I placed her on a shelf in the corner, thinking she'd add a touch of whimsy to the room. It didn't take long for the strangeness to begin. The first incident was minor Clara would move. Not drastically, just slight shifts in position. Her head tilted at a different angle, her hands resting in a different pose. I assumed Daniel was messing with me until he admitted, with a nervous laugh, that he thought I was the one moving her. "Let's just get rid of it," he said one evening, clearly uncomfortable. But something stopped me. Clara felt tied to the house. Throwing her away felt wrong, like breaking an unspoken rule. A week later, I started hearing noises. It would always begin at night, soft creaking sounds coming from the attic. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but the noises grew louder, footsteps deliberate and rhythmic pacing back and forth. Daniel claimed he didn't hear them, but I saw the tension in his jaw whenever I brought it up. We stopped going into the attic unless absolutely necessary. Clara remained on her shelf, her glassy eyes watching over the space. One night, while Daniel was working late, I decided to confront whatever was happening. Armed with a flashlight and a ridiculous sense of bravery, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was cold,
colder than the rest of the house, and the beam of my flashlight seemed to dim as I stepped inside. Clara sat exactly where I had left her, but the rocking chair was swaying, as if someone had just gotten up. I froze, my heart pounding.
"Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rocking chair stopped. I don't remember running back downstairs, but I do remember locking the attic door behind me and staying in the living room until Daniel came home.
"I'm not imagining this," I told him, tears streaming down my face. Daniel sighed, his skepticism wavering. "Okay, we'll get rid of her tomorrow." But Clara had other plans. That night, we woke up to the sound of the attic door creaking.
Open. Daniel grabbed a baseball bat and went to investigate while I stayed frozen in bed clutching my phone.
He came back pale and shaken. "The doll isn't there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We found Clara in the living room, sitting on the coffee table. Her head was tilted in that eerie way, her cracked cheek catching the moonlight. "We're burning her," Daniel said, grabbing a trash bag. We drove to an empty field on the outskirts of town, built a small bonfire, and threw Clara in. Her dress caught fire immediately, but her porcelain face seemed to resist the flames. As the fire consumed her, a high-pitched wail filled the air, so loud and piercing that we both covered our ears. When the flames died down, nothing was left of Clara but a pile of ash. We drove home in silence, too shaken to speak. For a while, everything seemed normal. The noises stopped and the house felt lighter. I even started using the attic as my art studio, though I always kept the door locked when I wasn't inside. But last week, while organizing some old canvases, I found something. In the corner where Clara's rocking chair had once sat was a small porcelain hand. It was cracked and blackened, but unmistakably hers. Now, every night, I hear the sound of footsteps in the attic. And sometimes, when I look up at the circular window, I see a shadow watching me. The shop was tucked away in the oldest part of town, a place where cobblestone streets echoed with the whispers of centuries past. It was a small storefront with peeling paint and a faded wooden sign that read, "Marguerite's Dolls, unique creations for unique souls." I wasn't looking for a doll that day, let alone anything tied to a place like that. I was simply wandering, trying to kill time before a late lunch with an old friend. The shop caught my eye because it didn't belong. Among modern cafes and trendy boutiques, Marguerite's was a relic. Curiosity led me through the creaking door, and the smell of aged wood and lavender hit me immediately. The interior was dim, lit by a single flickering chandelier. Dolls of every shape and size lined the shelves, porcelain, cloth, even wood. Each one was crafted with painstaking detail, their expressions eerily lifelike. A voice startled me. "Can I help you find something?" I turned to see a woman standing behind the counter. She was older, with sharp features and a strange, knowing smile. Her hands, delicate and slightly wrinkled, rested on the glass counter, filled with doll parts tiny, eyes, miniature shoes, and dainty hands. "Oh no," I stammered. "I was just looking." Her smile deepened. "People rarely come in here by accident. Perhaps you're looking for a gift? Or something more personal?" I felt a strange chill at her words. "I'm not really a doll person," I said, trying to sound casual. Her eyes seemed to glimmer. "Ah, but you haven't met her yet." Before I could respond, she turned and retrieved a doll from a shelf behind her. It was unlike any I'd ever seen, small, no more than 12 inches tall, with a porcelain face so detailed it could have been modelled after a real child. Her dark eyes seemed to follow me, and her auburn curls framed her face perfectly. She wore a simple cream-coloured dress with lace trim, and her tiny shoes were polished to a shine. "She's special," the woman said, placing the doll on the counter. "Her name is Eliza. A very old creation of mine, meant only for someone who truly appreciates her." I shook my head. "I don't think—" "She's free," the woman interrupted. "A gift. She'll find her way to you eventually, so why not take her now?" The words sent a shiver down my spine, but I found myself unable to refuse. I didn't want the doll, but something in the woman's tone made it feel as though I had no choice. I took Eliza home, placing her on a shelf in my living room, with every intention of forgetting about her. But forgetting was impossible. The moment she entered my home, strange things began to happen. It started with small sounds, the faint tapping of tiny feet on hardwood floors, the creak of a rocking chair in the middle of the night. I tried to convince myself it was just the
house settling, but then Eliza began to move.
I'd find her in different positions, her head tilted, or her arms reaching out as if she were begging to be held. Once, I woke up to find her sitting at the foot of my bed, her dark eyes fixed on me. "Did you move the doll?" I asked my sister when she came to visit. She gave me a strange look. "What doll?" When I pointed to the shelf, Eliza was gone. My sister laughed nervously, but I could see the unease in her eyes. "You probably misplaced it," she said, but I knew better. I found Eliza later that night in the kitchen, sitting on the counter, next to a knife. By then the dreams had started. In them, I was in Marguerite's shop, but it was dark, and the shelves were empty. Marguerite stood in the center of the room, holding Eliza. She whispered strange words I couldn't understand, her voice a low, menacing hum. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I decided to get rid of Eliza. I threw her into a donation bin at the local thrift store, feeling a weight lift as I drove away. But that night, she was back. She sat on the shelf as if she had never left, her glassy eyes glinting in the moonlight. Desperation drove me to research Marguerite's dolls. What I found chilled me to the core. The shop had been around for over a century, passed down through generations of women in Marguerite's family. Local legends claimed that the dolls were cursed, each one containing a fragment of the original Marguerite's soul. Those who accepted a doll were bound to it and to her for life. Terrified, I returned to the shop the next day, clutching Eliza in trembling hands. But when I arrived, the storefront was boarded up. A sign read, "Closed permanently." I stood there, clutching the doll, as an elderly man approached. "Looking for Marguerite's?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Do you know where she went?" He shook his head. "That place has been closed for decades, burned down in the 70s. You must be mistaken." "But I was just there," I insisted. He gave me a sad smile. "You're not the first to say that." Now Eliza sits on my shelf, a silent, watching presence. I've tried everything to get rid of her, burning, burying, even tossing her into the river, but she always comes back. At night, I hear her whispers. They're faint, almost like a child's voice calling my name. I know she's waiting, and deep down, I know I'll never be free. When I pointed to the shelf, Eliza was gone. My sister laughed nervously, but I could see the unease in her eyes. You probably misplaced it, she said, but I knew better. I found Eliza later that night in the kitchen, sitting on the counter, next to a knife. By then, the dreams had started. In them, I was in Marguerite's shop, but it was dark, and the shelves were empty. Marguerite stood in the center of the room, holding Eliza. She whispered strange words I couldn't understand, her voice a low, menacing hum. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I decided to get rid of Eliza. I threw her into a donation bin at the local thrift store, feeling a weight lift as I drove away. But that night, she was back. She sat on the shelf as if she had never left, her glassy eyes glinting in the moonlight. Desperation drove me to research Marguerite's dolls. What I found chilled me to the core. The shop had been around for over a century, passed down through generations of women in Marguerite's family. Local legends claimed that the dolls were cursed, each one containing a fragment of the original Marguerite's soul. Those who accepted a doll were bound to it and to her for life. Terrified, I returned to the shop the next day, clutching Eliza in trembling hands. But when I arrived, the storefront was boarded up. A sign read, "Closed permanently." I stood there, clutching the doll, as an elderly man approached. "Looking for Marguerite's?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Do you know where she went?" He shook his head. "That place has been closed for decades, burned down in the 70s. You must be mistaken." "But I was just there," I insisted. He gave me a sad smile. "You're not the first to say that." Now Eliza sits on my shelf, a silent, watching presence. I've tried everything to get rid of her, burning, burying, even tossing her into the river, but she always comes back. At night, I hear her whispers. They're faint, almost like a child's voice calling my name. I know she's waiting, and deep down, I know I'll never be free. That relief was short-lived. When I returned home, the doll was sitting on the mantel, exactly where she had been before. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone to call a friend. I explained everything about the doll, the footsteps, the eerie feeling of being watched. My friend, Sarah, agreed to come over and help me figure out what to do. When she arrived, she laughed nervously at the sight of the doll. "It's just a toy," she said, though her voice wavered. We decided to burn it. We took the doll into the backyard and placed it in a metal fire pit. I doused it in lighter fluid and lit a match, but as soon as the flames touched the doll, the fire died out. The doll remained unscathed, her green eyes glinting as if mocking our efforts. Sarah suggested we bury her instead. We dug a deep hole in the woods behind my house and placed the doll inside, covering her with dirt and rocks. I felt a strange sense of finality as we walked away, as if we had finally succeeded. That night, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. The doll stood in the doorway, her green eyes glowing in the darkness. She didn't move, but I felt her presence pressing down on me, suffocating and all-consuming. I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, I contacted a local historian who specialized in folklore. When I told her about the doll, she grew silent. "That doll," she said, her voice grave, "matches the description of one created by a doll maker in the late 1800s. Her dolls were rumored to be cursed, each one imbued with a fragment of her soul. If you've accepted her into your home, she won't leave willingly. She's bound to you now." I begged her for a solution, but the woman only offered cryptic advice.
"You must find the doll maker's mark," she said. "If you destroy that, you may be able to break the connection. But be warned, the doll will not let you succeed without a fight." Armed with a magnifying glass and a sense of dread, I searched
the doll for the mark. It was hidden beneath her dress, a small engraving on the porcelain near her hip, swirling intricate symbol that seemed to pulse under my touch. As soon as I tried to scratch it off, the room grew cold. The lights flickered and a piercing scream filled the air. The doll's green eyes seemed to glow brighter, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, the doll was gone and the house was silent. But I know she's not gone for good. Every now and then I hear the faint giggle, feel the weight of unseen eyes, and catch glimpses of golden curls in the corners of my vision. She's still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And when she does, I don't think I'll be able to stop her. Growing up, my sister Emma and I often spent our summers at our grandparents' house in the countryside. Their home was a treasure trove of antiques, curiosities, and family heirlooms, but one room was strictly off-limits: the doll room. Grandma had always warned us to stay away from it. She would say it was filled with fragile, valuable dolls from her travels, and she didn't want us breaking anything. Emma and I, curious as children are, would occasionally peek through the cracked door, stealing glimpses of the dozens of dolls staring blankly from their perches. Their lifelike eyes and eerily perfect faces were unnerving, even in daylight. But as the years passed, we learned to ignore the room, treating it as just another quirk of the old house. That changed when Grandma passed away last year. Emma and I were tasked with helping our parents sort through her belongings. While my parents focused on the more practical tasks, Emma and I were drawn to the doll room, compelled by the mystery that had surrounded it our entire lives. The room smelled of lavender and dust. Shelves lined the walls, each one crammed with dolls of every size and style. Porcelain faces, glassy eyes, and intricate clothing greeted us, each doll seemingly frozen mid-thought. At the center of this collection was an ornate display case housing a single doll that seemed to command the room's attention. She was larger than the rest, dressed in a scarlet gown embroidered with gold thread. Her hair was a cascade of raven-black curls, and her eyes, deep, dark, and haunting, seemed almost alive. A plaque at the base of the display read, "Marisol, 1887. "I don't like this," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. Neither did I, but something about Marisol drew me closer. Her craftsmanship was impeccable, every detail a testament to the skill of her maker. But as I stared into her eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine, as though she was staring back. Later that night, as we packed boxes, Emma and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to dance on the walls, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the house, though no one else was upstairs. When I went to bed, I had the strangest dream. I was in the doll room, but it wasn't just a room. It was a vast, dark space filled with whispers and faint laughter. Marisol stood in the center, her eyes glowing faintly. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. I woke up drenched in sweat, the feeling of her presence lingering. The following day, strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut without warning, and the air grew heavy with an unexplainable tension. Emma and I decided to confront the doll room one last time. We entered together, armed with flashlights and a vague sense of bravery. The room felt colder than before, and the dolls seemed different, as if their positions had subtly shifted. Marisol's display case was empty. "Where is she?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. A soft, melodic humming filled the air, coming from somewhere behind us. We turned to see Marisol standing in the doorway, her lifeless face tilted slightly, her dark eyes fixed on us. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, our parents were shaking us awake on the living room floor. They didn't believe us when we told them what had happened, dismissing it as stress or overactive imaginations. We tried to leave the house that day, but the car wouldn't start. Cell service was non-existent, and the landline phone produced nothing but static. Trapped, we decided to spend one final night there. That evening, Emma and I locked ourselves in the guest bedroom, determined to stay together. We blocked the door with furniture and kept a flashlight by the bed. Around midnight, the humming started again. It was faint at first, growing louder and more distinct as the minutes passed. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Emma and I froze, clutching each other as the door rattled violently. The furniture we'd piled against it slid across the floor as though pushed by an invisible force. "Why are you hiding?" a voice called, soft and melodic, yet filled with malice. The door flew open, and there she was, Marisol, standing in the doorway. Her porcelain face twisted into a smile, her dark eyes glinting with something that was undeniably alive. "You should have left."
"Me alone," she said. The next moments were a blur. Emma screamed, and I grabbed the flashlight, shining it directly at Marisol.
The light seemed to disorient her, and she let out an ear-piercing shriek. Seizing the moment, we bolted from the room, racing down the stairs and out of the house. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the property, where the car suddenly roared to life. We never went back to that house. A week later, we received a call from the estate's executor, asking if we had taken anything from the doll room. He sounded nervous, almost panicked, as he explained that Marisol's display case had been found shattered, the doll missing. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. To this day, I don't know where Marisol is. Sometimes I wake, in the middle of the night, to the faint sound of humming, and I can't help but feel that she's still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. When my husband and I bought our dream house, we thought we had found the perfect place to start a new chapter in our lives. It was a charming Victorian home, complete with creaky floorboards, a sprawling garden, and an attic filled with dusty relics from the past. The attic was a labyrinth of old trunks, faded photographs, and forgotten treasures. Among them was a peculiar doll that immediately caught my attention. She was tucked away in a corner, her porcelain face half hidden beneath a tattered lace veil. She was unlike any doll I had ever seen. Her dress was an elaborate deep blue satin, trimmed with silver embroidery, and her eyes were a haunting shade of green, almost luminous in the dim light. Her hair, golden and intricately curled, framed a face that looked far too lifelike. "Creepy," my husband Luke muttered when he saw me holding the doll. "You're not planning on keeping that, are you?" "I don't know," I replied, though something about the doll compelled me to bring her downstairs. We placed her on the mantelpiece in the living room, thinking she'd add a touch of vintage charm to the space, but almost immediately, strange things began to happen. That first night, I woke to the sound of soft laughter echoing through the house. It was faint, almost like a child's giggle, and seemed to be coming from the living room. I nudged Luke, awake, but by the time he checked, the room was silent. The next morning, we found the doll in a different position. She was no longer sitting upright, but leaning slightly, her head tilted as if watching us. I tried to convince myself it was just gravity or the vibrations of the house, but unease began to creep in. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. Doors slammed on their own, lights flickered without explanation, and we often heard faint whispers that stopped as soon as we tried to locate their source. One evening, as we were watching a movie, the television turned off abruptly. The remote was on the table, untouched. Luke got up to check the fuse box, and as soon as he left the room, the doll fell forward, her porcelain face landing with a soft thud against the mantel. "I'm getting rid of that thing," Luke declared when he came back and saw the doll's new position. But when he picked her up, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His face turned pale, and he quickly set her down. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, too afraid to speak. That night, I dreamt of the doll. In the dream, she wasn't just a doll, she was alive, her green eyes glowing, with malice as she whispered my name. She spoke of the house's dark history, of the family that had lived there before us, and of a tragedy that had left a child's spirit trapped inside her porcelain shell. When I woke, the room was freezing, and the doll was sitting on the chair by the bed, though we had left her in the living room. The final straw came a few nights later. Luke and I were awakened by the sound of shattering glass. We rushed downstairs to find the living room in disarray. The mirror above the fireplace was broken, shards scattered across the floor. The doll sat in the center of the mantel, her head now turned to face the broken mirror. "We can't stay here," Luke said, his voice firm. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the house. We called a priest to bless the property and hired a team to remove the doll and anything else that might be tied to its sinister energy. Months later, after moving to a new home, I received an email from the team we had hired. They explained that the doll had been taken to a storage facility, but strange occurrences had followed. Workers reported hearing whispers and seeing the doll move on its own. Eventually, the facility burned down in a mysterious fire, and the doll was presumed destroyed. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint giggles and feel the chilling gaze of those luminous green eyes, as if the doll isn't quite done with us yet. Quite done. It began the summer I decided to clean out my grandmother's old house. She had passed away the previous year, leaving her sprawling property in the countryside to me. The house, a mix of charm and eerie solitude, stood surrounded by dense woods. My grandmother was known for her eccentricity, her home brimming with antiques and artifacts that she had collected during her travels. But none were as peculiar as the wooden cradle that I found tucked away in the attic. The cradle was handcrafted, with intricate carvings of roses and vines along its sides. It was beautiful, but unsettling. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten blankets, was a doll that seemed to stare right through me. Her face was made of wood, painted with remarkable detail. Her lips were pursed in a subtle smile, and her dark, glossy eyes reflected the dim light from the attic bulb. A strange sensation washed over me as I picked her up, as though the room had grown quieter, the air heavier. I convinced myself it was just the isolation of the attic playing tricks on me. I brought the cradle and the doll downstairs, planning to clean it and sell it along with the other antiques. But the moment it was placed in the living room, the atmosphere of the house changed. That first night, I woke to a faint creaking sound. It was rhythmic, like the gentle rock of a cradle. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The next morning, I found the doll sitting upright in the cradle. I was sure I had left her lying down. Her wooden eyes seemed to meet mine as I stood there, frozen. Over the next few days, things escalated. Lights flickered, cold drafts swept through the house despite the summer heat, and I started hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers carried distinct words, my name, soft pleas and eerie lullabies in a language I didn't recognize. One evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, I heard the unmistakable sound of a child humming. It was coming from the living room. I walked in slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The cradle was rocking gently, the doll seated upright and staring at me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The room fell silent, save for the soft creak of the cradle. I grabbed the doll, intending to throw it out, but the moment my hand touched her, a cold shock traveled up my arm, and I heard a child's voice, faint and distant. "Don't leave me," it said. I dropped the doll and stumbled back, my chest tight with fear. The next day, I called my friend Claire, who had an interest in the paranormal. When she arrived, she took one look at the doll and the cradle and paled. "This isn't just any doll," she said, her voice hushed. "There's something attached to it." Claire explained that such objects could hold residual energy, sometimes even spirits. The carvings on the cradle, she noted, included symbols that were not decorative. They were protective wards, likely meant to keep something contained. "What do we do?" I asked, desperate to be rid of the oppressive energy in the house. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual," Claire replied. That night, we prepared a simple ritual with sage, salt, and candles. As Claire began to chant, the air in the room grew thick, and the whispers returned, louder this time. The cradle began to rock violently, and the doll's wooden face seemed to twist, her painted smile warping into a grimace. Then the voice came again, no longer a faint whisper, but a desperate wail. "Don't leave me, please!" The candles flickered wildly, and the room felt like it was closing in. Claire continued her chant, her voice steady despite the chaos. Finally, with a loud crack, the cradle split in two, and the doll fell to the floor. The oppressive energy lifted immediately, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Claire and I burned the remnants of the cradle and buried the doll deep in the woods, encircled by salt. I sold the house shortly after, unable to shake the memories of that summer. But even now, in the safety of my new home, I sometimes wake to the faint sound of a cradle rocking and a child's voice whispering, "Don't leave me." I had never been a fan of old-fashioned toys, especially dolls. There was something unnerving about their glassy eyes and lifeless expressions. So when my sister Maya gifted me an antique porcelain doll for my birthday, I was less than thrilled. "This is a collector's item," Maya said, beaming as she placed the doll in my hands. It was beautiful, in an old-world way. Her dress was made of lace and silk, her hair was meticulously styled, and her green eyes glimmered in the light. "I found her at an estate sale. Isn't she perfect?" I forced a smile, knowing Maya had gone out of her way to find something unique. "She's lovely," I lied, placing the doll on a shelf in my living room. Days turned into weeks, and the doll became just another part of the decor. But then, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Items moved from their original spots, lights flickering for no reason, and an occasional chill in the air despite the warm summer weather. I dismissed it as my imagination or minor electrical issues. One evening, I was curled
up on the couch reading a book when I heard a faint sound.
It was like the rustling of fabric, soft and deliberate. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. My gaze landed on the doll, her unblinking eyes staring at me. "Creepy thing," I muttered, standing up to turn her around. The next morning, I found her facing forward again. I frowned, convinced I had left her turned away. Perhaps Maya had stopped by and moved her, though I couldn't recall letting her in. The following night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoed through the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone, its flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly and I held my breath, straining to hear. Suddenly I felt a cold breeze and my phone's light flickered. When it stabilized, I saw her, the doll, sitting in the middle of the hallway. Her head was tilted slightly, her green eyes glinting in the dim light. I froze, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Had someone broken in? But how could they have moved the doll so silently? I picked her up with shaking hands and put her back on the shelf, determined to get rid of her the next day. But as dawn broke, I found her sitting on my nightstand. Fear turned into desperation as I called Maya, explaining everything in a frantic rush. "You're overthinking it," she said, laughing nervously. "It's just a doll, Emma." "No, Maya," I insisted.
"There's something wrong with it. I'm getting rid of it today." That afternoon, I drove to the nearest donation centre and left the doll on their counter without a second glance. Relief washed over me as I returned home, but it was short-lived. That night I woke to the same footsteps. This time they were faster, more frantic. When I turned on the light, the doll was there, sitting on the foot of my bed, her head tilted further, her smile sharper, almost mocking. I screamed and backed away, knocking over a lamp. The doll didn't move, but the room filled with an oppressive energy, heavy and suffocating. Whispers surrounded me, too faint to understand but loud enough to terrify. Desperate, I grabbed the doll and drove to a remote area in the woods. With trembling hands, I dug a shallow hole and buried her, praying it would end the nightmare. For a while it did. My home felt lighter, the strange occurrences stopped, and I began to sleep peacefully again. But 2 weeks later, as I was cleaning my bedroom, I found her. She was sitting on the shelf where it all began, her green eyes glimmering with malicious delight. I knew then that she wasn't just a doll. She was a silent companion, bound to me, and no matter how far I ran, she would always find her way back. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her old Victorian home. It stood at the edge of town, its towering spires and ornate woodwork giving it an eerie charm. Growing up, I had spent countless summers there, exploring its endless hallways and dusty corners. Moving in wasn't something I had planned, but the timing worked out. My apartment lease had ended, and the house was mine now. However, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that came with its silence. On my first night, as I unpacked boxes, I decided to explore the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, but I remembered it as a treasure trove of old trinkets and forgotten memories. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed up,
flashlight in hand. The attic was just as I remembered, dusty, filled with cobwebs and packed with antique furniture and boxes. One box caught my eye. It was small, wrapped in faded floral paper and tied with a delicate ribbon. My grandmother had always been meticulous about her belongings, and this looked intentionally preserved. Inside was a porcelain doll, its face cracked in places with large, glassy blue eyes that seemed to stare into my soul. Its dress was a faded shade of blue, trimmed with lace, and its golden curls were still intact, though dusty. I shivered. I'd always disliked dolls, but something about this one was particularly unnerving. As I held it, a note slipped out from the folds of its dress. It was written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting, "Keep her happy, and she will keep you safe." I frowned, unsure what that meant. Shaking my head, I placed the doll back in the box and shoved it into the far corner of the attic. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood at the foot of my bed, her face pale and expressionless.
"Don't ignore her," she whispered. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was dark, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floor above me, the attic. Shaking off the dream, I convinced myself it was
just my imagination. The next day, I noticed small things around the house. A picture frame had fallen over. The kitchen cabinet doors were ajar. The lights flickered occasionally. I brushed it off as the house settling. But then the scraping sounds grew louder at night, and I began to hear faint laughter, a child's giggle that sent chills down my spine. One evening, I decided to confront the attic. Flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs, determined to find the source of the disturbances. The doll was no longer in its box. It sat on an old chair in the middle of the room, its cracked face tilted as if watching me. I swallowed hard, feeling the air grow colder around me. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady my shaking voice. "This is ridiculous." I picked up the doll and carried it downstairs, placing it on the mantel. "There, you're out in the open. Happy now?" I said, half jokingly, though my heart raced. That night, the giggles stopped, but the dreams intensified. My grandmother appeared again, her expression more urgent. "Do not anger her," she said. The following day, I noticed changes. The doll seemed to move on its own. One moment it would be on the mantel, the next on the couch, or the dining table. Its blue eyes followed me everywhere, unblinking and unnerving. I decided to get rid of it. Driving to a nearby thrift store, I handed the doll over without a second thought. Relief washed over me as I left, convinced the nightmare was over. But when I returned home, the doll was there, sitting on the mantel, her cracked face smiling ever so slightly. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Keep her happy. Desperate, I began to care for the doll, dusting her, fixing her dress, and even talking to her as if she were alive. The disturbances subsided, but the house never felt right. One day, as I cleaned the attic, I found another note tucked inside, a book. It was from my grandmother again, and it read, "She is bound to this house and to our family. Protect her, and she will protect you. Abandon her, and she will destroy you." I realized then that the doll wasn't just an object. She was a guardian, or perhaps a curse passed down through generations. Now I live in the house with her, always mindful of her presence. She hasn't moved in weeks, but I still feel her, watching, waiting. The silence is heavy, but it's better than the alternative, than the The weekend I inherited my Aunt Helena's sprawling country estate, I was both excited and apprehensive. The house, built in the 1800s, was as grand as it was foreboding. It was the type of place that seemed alive, where every creak and shadow whispered untold secrets. When I arrived, the air smelled of aged wood and lavender, my aunt's favorite scent. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, handed me the keys with a worried expression. "Did she leave you anything specific in the will, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. "No, just the house," I replied. Mrs. Calloway hesitated, then said, "Be careful in the parlour." I frowned, but before I could ask what she meant, she shuffled off, leaving me with my bags and an odd sense of foreboding. The parlour, as I discovered, was a room frozen in time. A faint layer of dust coated the antique furniture, and the sunlight, streaming through lace curtains, gave the room a golden glow. At the centre of it all, sitting on an elaborate chair, was a doll. It was unlike any doll I'd ever seen. Its porcelain skin was flawless, and its glass eyes shimmered as if they could see. It wore a crimson silk dress, trimmed with tiny black buttons, and its long black hair was neatly braided. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Something about the doll made my stomach churn, though I couldn't pinpoint why. As I reached out to pick it up, I noticed a folded note tucked under its arm. The handwriting was Aunt Helena's, unmistakable in its elegant flourishes. "To the keeper of this house, treat her kindly, or she will treat you cruelly." I stared at the words, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Mrs. Calloway's warning replayed in my mind, but I shook it off. It was just a dollar relic from my aunt's collection of oddities. That night, I placed the doll in a cabinet in the parlour and locked it, hoping to forget about it. But the house had other plans. At midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. Groggy and annoyed, I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound. It led me back to the parlour. The cabinet door was wide open. The doll was back on the chair, its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. My heart raced as I approached. I knew I had locked that cabinet. The key was still in my pocket. "You're just a doll," I muttered, my voice shaky. The next morning, I called Mrs. Calloway, demanding answers. She was hesitant to speak, but after some coaxing, she relented. "That doll has been in this house for generations," she said. "Your aunt called her Clara. She said Clara protected the house, but only if she was respected." "Respected?" I echoed, disbelief colouring my tone. "Yes, keep her clean, speak to her. Kindly, never lock her away." I wanted to laugh, but the gravity in Mrs. Calloway's voice stopped me. The following days were unsettling. Clara would appear in different rooms, her position always slightly altered. At first, I thought it was my imagination or stress, but when I locked her in the basement one evening and found her back in the parlour the next morning, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to get rid of her. Driving to a local antique shop, I explained the doll's eerie tendencies to the shopkeeper, who accepted her with a knowing nod. "That's an old soul you've got there," he said. I didn't care. I just wanted her gone. When I returned home, the house felt lighter. I spent the evening celebrating with a glass of wine, relieved to finally be free. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of shattering glass. My heart pounded as I crept downstairs, clutching a heavy candlestick for protection. There, in the middle of the parlour, was Clara. Her crimson dress was pristine, her glass eyes glinting in the moonlight. The air grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I saw nothing, but the sensation of being watched was unbearable. Aunt Helena's words from the note echoed in my mind. "Treat her kindly, or she will treat you cruelly. Desperate, I placed Clara back on her chair and whispered an apology. The house grew silent, but I knew I had crossed a line. Now Clara remains in her chair, untouched and unmoving, yet her presence is palpable. I dust her dress daily, speak to her softly, and leave offerings of lavender sachets her favorite, according to Aunt Helena's diary. I don't know what Clara is or why she chooses to stay, but I do know one thing: I will never cross her again. But when I first came across the doll, I was at a flea market in a tiny, forgotten town during a road trip. The vendor, a hunched-over old woman with cloudy blue eyes, sat behind her table filled with dusty trinkets and antiques. Among them was the doll perched on a faded velvet cushion. Its face was porcelain, delicate and eerily lifelike. Its pale blue eyes seemed to follow me, framed by long lashes and crowned with golden curls that tumbled past its shoulders. It wore a lacy white dress that had clearly seen better days, yellowed with age. Despite its worn appearance, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. "Beautiful, isn't she?" the vendor croaked, her voice gravelly. I nodded hesitantly. "How much?" The old woman's lips curled into a grin that sent shivers down my spine. "For you? $30. It felt like a bargain for such a unique antique, though something about the woman's demeanor unsettled me. Still, I handed her the cash, and she placed the doll in a weathered shoebox, carefully wrapping it in tissue paper. As I walked away, I heard her mutter, "Take care of her, or she'll take care of you." I dismissed it as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman, but the words lingered in my mind. When I got home, I placed the doll on a high shelf in my living room. Its ethereal beauty added a certain charm to the space. For a while, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then the whispers began. It started a few nights later. I was in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard faint murmuring. It was so soft I thought I was imagining it. I sat up and strained my ears, but the house was silent. The next night, it happened again. This time, the whispering was clearer, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a child's voice, faint and melodic, coming from the
living room. I tiptoed down the hallway, heart pounding. The living room was dark, lit only by the glow of the moon through the window. The doll sat on its shelf, as still as ever.
I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the wind outside, or my overactive imagination. But as I turned to leave, I thought I saw the doll's head tilt slightly. "No," I muttered to myself. "It's just a trick of the light." The days that followed were a blur of unease. Objects began moving on their own, nothing drastic, just small things. A book would be on the coffee table instead of the shelf, or my keys would turn up in strange places. One morning, I woke to find the doll sitting in a chair by the window, even though I was sure I had left it on the shelf. "Who's doing this?" I shouted into the empty house, my voice trembling. That night, I set up a camera in the living room, determined to catch the pranksterer, at least put my mind at ease. The footage was horrifying. At first, everything seemed normal. The doll sat motionless on its shelf, bathed in the pale glow of the camera's night vision. But around 2 a.m., the doll's head turned slowly, its glassy eyes scanning the room. I watched in frozen terror as its tiny porcelain hands moved, gripping the edge of the shelf. It climbed down with unnatural grace, its movements jerky yet deliberate. The doll wandered the room, pausing to tilt its head as if listening. Then it stopped directly in front of the camera, staring into the lens. The screen went black. I couldn't stay in the house after that. I packed a bag and checked into a motel, leaving the doll behind. But the whispers followed me. Every night I heard the same faint murmuring, no matter where I went. It was as if the doll's presence was etched into my mind. Desperate, I returned home and decided to get rid of it. I drove to the nearest river, the doll wrapped in a blanket in my trunk. As I approached the water's edge, I hesitated. For a moment, the whispers grew louder, pleading, almost desperate. "Please don't," a voice whispered in my ear. I screamed and hurled the doll into the river, watching as it sank beneath the surface. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I thought it was over. But when I woke the next morning, the doll was back. It sat on my bedside table, its porcelain face cracked and water dripping from its dress. Its lips were parted, and for the first time, I understood the words, "You can't get rid of me. You." I never intended to collect dolls. My grandmother's attic was filled with them, dusty remnants of her younger days. Most were ordinary, their painted faces chipped and faded. But Charlotte was different. I found her nestled in a wooden chest, wrapped in delicate, moth-eaten fabric. The doll was exquisite, her porcelain face eerily lifelike, with emerald green eyes that seemed to shimmer in the dim attic light. Her auburn curls framed her face perfectly, and she wore a green velvet dress with intricate gold embroidery. "Charlotte," my grandmother said from behind me, startling me. She had a faraway look in her eyes, her lips pursed. "She was special. Your great-grandfather bought her in France before the war. But be careful with her. She's been known to cause trouble." "Trouble?" I asked, laughing nervously. My grandmother didn't laugh. "Just don't make her angry." I thought it was an odd joke, but something about her tone unsettled me. Despite her warning, I took Charlotte home, intending to display her as a beautiful antique piece. From the moment Charlotte entered my house, things felt off. At first, it was subtle. I'd leave her sitting on a shelf in the living room, only to find her in the corner of the couch. Once I discovered her on my dining table, her tiny hands delicately resting on my unfinished crossword puzzle. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd moved her and forgotten. Maybe my cat had knocked her around. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then the nightmares started. Every night, I dreamed of Charlotte standing at the foot of my bed, her green eyes glowing in the dark. She never moved in the dreams, but her presence was suffocating. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. One night, I woke to find her sitting on the floor by my bed. I was certain I'd left her in the living room. "Okay," I muttered, picking her up. "This is getting weird." I placed her in a cabinet with a glass door and locked it, hoping to keep her contained. The next morning, the cabinet was empty. I tore through the house, searching every corner. Charlotte was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until I went to the kitchen to make coffee that I saw her. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her tiny porcelain hand resting on a knife. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as her emerald eyes seemed to gleam with malice. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Of course, she didn't answer. She was just a doll. But her presence felt alive, almost sentient. I decided then and there to get rid of her. I drove to the edge of town to a sprawling landfill. I didn't care how valuable Charlotte might have been, I just wanted her gone. I buried her under piles of garbage, ensuring she wouldn't be found easily. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. But when I returned home, Charlotte was waiting for me on the living room couch. Her green eyes seemed brighter, her velvet dress impossibly clean. "You can't get rid of me," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. It wasn't my voice, but it wasn't audible either. It was as if the words were planted directly into my thoughts. I screamed and flung her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening thud but didn't break. Instead, she landed upright, her unblinking eyes
fixed on me.
Over the next few days, my life became a nightmare. I'd hear faint laughter echoing through the house. Lights would flicker, doors would slam shut on their own, and objects would move when I wasn't looking. One night, I woke to find Charlotte sitting on my chest, her porcelain face inches from mine. Her lips moved, though no sound came out. I threw her off me and ran out of the house, shaking with terror. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in antiques. When I mentioned Charlotte, his expression turned grave. "She's a haunted doll," he explained. "Her original owner, a young girl named Eloisa, died tragically, and her spirit became attached to the doll. They say the doll seeks revenge on anyone who disrespects her." "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Shook his head. "There's no getting rid of her. But if you treat her kindly, she might leave you alone." Reluctantly, I returned home and retrieved Charlotte from the corner where I'd left her. I cleaned her dress, combed her hair, and placed her back on the shelf. For a while, the activity stopped. The house was quiet, and I began to think the historian was right. But every now and then, I catch her staring at me, her emerald eyes glinting with a mischievous light. I don't dare move her anymore. She's, watching, always watching, waiting for me to slip up. And I know that if I do, she'll make sure I regret it. I had never believed in haunted dolls. The very idea seemed like something out of a cheesy horror movie. But that changed the day I met Elise, a doll collector who had recently moved into the old Victorian house at the end of my street. Elise was an eccentric woman, her home filled with vintage dolls. She invited me over one day, excited to show off her prized possession. The moment I stepped into her parlor, my eyes were drawn to a doll seated prominently on a mirrored shelf. The doll was exquisite, with glassy blue eyes that seemed almost too real, and a head of golden curls. She wore a lavender dress trimmed with lace, and a tiny locket dangled from her neck. The name Lilith was inscribed on a brass plaque beneath her stand. "She's stunning, isn't she?" Elise said, noticing my fascination. "She's intense," I replied, feeling a strange unease. Elise chuckled. "Lilith has a story. They say she belonged to a little girl who vanished without a trace. Some believe her spirit lives in the doll." As the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Lilith. Whenever I visited Elise, the doll seemed to be watching me. Her eyes would follow me around the room, though logically I knew it was just a trick of the light. One evening, Elise called me in a panic. Her voice trembled as she begged me to come over. When I arrived, I found her pacing the living room, her face pale and drawn. "It's Lilith," she whispered. "She's moved." "What do you mean, moved?" I left her in the parlor, but when I came back, she was in my bedroom sitting on the dresser. And the mirror? She trailed off, her voice shaking. She led me to her room. There, perched on the dresser, was Lilith. But it wasn't the doll that sent a chill down my spine, it was the mirror behind her. The reflection showed Lilith smiling, her painted lips twisted into a malevolent grin. But the real doll remained expressionless. That night, Elise decided to get rid of Lilith. We wrapped her in a blanket, stuffed her into a box, and drove out to a remote field. Elise hurled the box into a ravine, and we left without looking back. For a few days, everything seemed normal. Elise's house felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere was gone. But then, late one night, she called me again. "I think she's back," Elise whispered, her voice barely audible over the phone. When I arrived, I found Elise sitting on the floor of her parlor, clutching a glass of wine with trembling hands. "She's in the mirror," she said, pointing to the large antique mirror on the wall. I turned to look. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then, as I leaned closer, I saw her. Lilith's face stared back at me from the reflection, even though the doll was nowhere in the room. "She's haunting the mirrors," Elise said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." We decided to cover all the mirrors in the house, hoping to contain her. But it didn't work. Lilith's reflection began appearing in windows, picture frames, even puddles of water. Elise became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every shadow and refusing to sleep. One night she called me, sobbing hysterically. "She's in the bedroom mirror," she cried. "She's smiling at me. I think she wants me to join her." I rushed to her house, but when I arrived, it was too late. Elise was gone. The bedroom mirror was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Lilith was sitting on the bed, her tiny locket open to reveal a picture of Elise. I took the doll home, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. I locked her in a chest and buried it in my backyard, pouring salt and holy water over the grave. But now, as I write this, I can feel her watching me. Every time I pass a mirror, I see her glassy blue eyes glinting with malice, her painted lips curved into that sinister smile. I know it's only a matter of time before she finds her way back to me, and when she does, I fear there will be no escape. There will be no escape. When I first found the doll, it was tucked away in the dusty attic of the farmhouse I had recently inherited. Its face was partially hidden beneath a tangle of cobwebs, but even in the dim light, it was clear this doll was no ordinary plaything. It was crafted from porcelain with unnervingly detailed features. Her eyes, two perfectly round orbs of glass, gleamed with a lifelike intensity. Her dress, once elegant, was now faded and frayed, but her tiny shoes were untouched by time, as though she had never walked a single step, though that soon felt like an untruth. A note was attached to her wrist with a faded red ribbon. The scrawled handwriting read, "Do not listen to her." I should have left her there. I should have locked the attic and never gone back. But curiosity overruled reason, and I brought her downstairs. The first night, I placed the doll on a shelf in the living room. I didn't think much of her until I was jolted awake by the sound of faint whispering. It was an incoherent murmur, barely louder than the rustle of leaves, but it felt impossibly close. My heart pounding, I got out of bed and checked every corner of the house, When I reached the living room, the doll was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting on the couch, her tiny hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly as if she were waiting for me. I convinced myself I must have moved her and forgotten. But the whispers continued. Every night they grew louder. Sometimes I thought I could make out words, my name, repeated softly, or a quiet, insistent plea. Help
Me?
I tried locking her in a box and stuffing it in the closet. That night, the whispers became screams. They filled the house, echoing off the walls until I couldn't think straight. When I opened the closet door, the box was empty. She was back. On the shelf, her head turned toward me, her glass eyes gleaming. I started to lose sleep. The whispers invaded my dreams too. In them, I saw a little girl crying in a dark room, her face hidden behind her hands. Help me, she would sob. But when I reached out to comfort her, she would lift her head, and I would see the doll's face staring back at me. Desperate, I turned to the town's historian, an elderly woman named Margaret. She listened intently as I told her about the doll and my dreams. When I mentioned the farmhouse, her face paled. That doll, she said, her voice trembling, was made for a girl named Clara. She lived in that house over a century ago. Her father was a cruel man, and Clara would often hide in the attic to escape his wrath. One day she disappeared, and no one ever found her. The doll was the only thing left in her hiding place. Margaret looked at me with grave eyes. They say her spirit is trapped in it, reliving her torment, and if she speaks to you, don't listen. I tried everything to rid myself of the doll. I burned her, only to find her sitting on my nightstand the next morning, her dress unscathed. I threw her in the river, but she appeared on the shelf that same evening, her hair still damp. The whispers grew more insistent. Help me, she begged. He's coming. One night, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the house. They didn't belong to me. I stayed frozen in my bed, listening as they moved from room to room, growing closer. My bedroom door creaked open, and I felt a cold breath.
On my neck. Help me, the voice whispered, but it wasn't coming from the doll.
It was deep and menacing, filled with malice. By dawn, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed my things and left, leaving the doll behind. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Sitting on the back seat was the doll, her glass eyes locked onto mine. Help me, she whispered, her voice soft yet urgent. And for the first time, I understood. It wasn't Clara asking for help. It was the thing that had taken her, that When I saw the doll at the antique store, something about it stopped me in my tracks. Her porcelain skin was flawless, her rosy cheeks painted with such detail, it was as if she were blushing under my gaze. She wore a deep green velvet dress, trimmed with lace, and her glass eyes shimmered in the dim store light. She's one of a kind, the shopkeeper said, stepping out from behind the counter. Came from an estate sale, belonged to a collector. Quite the find, wouldn't you say? I wasn't a doll collector, but something about her felt magnetic. Before I knew it, I had paid for her and was carrying her home in a box. I had no idea what I had just invited into my life. The first few days, she simply sat on the shelf in my study, her expression serene, her posture rigid. My friends teased me about my new, creepy addition, but I waved them off. She's
art, I'd say, laughing. You just don't understand vintage charm. But then things started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle.
A faint tapping sound in the middle of the night. The sensation of being watched, even when I was alone. I began noticing small changes in her position, her head tilted slightly to the side, her hands resting differently in her lap. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Until one night, I woke up to find her sitting on the dresser in my bedroom. I hadn't moved her. My heart pounded as I stared at her silhouette in the dark. Her glass eyes seemed to glint, even in the fainty
moonlight.
Telling myself I must have carried her there and forgotten, I placed her back on the shelf in the study. But the next morning she was on the kitchen table, as if waiting for breakfast. I began researching the doll, trying to learn more about her history. The shopkeeper had mentioned the estate sale, so I started there. The collector she had belonged to, a man named Harold Whitman, had amassed hundreds of dolls over the years. But his obsession had taken a dark turn. According to old newspaper articles, Harold believed that certain dolls could house spirits. He had performed rituals to activate them, as he called it. One article mentioned his mysterious death. He had been found in his home, surrounded by his dolls, his face frozen in terror. The doll I had purchased was mentioned specifically. A rare porcelain doll in a green velvet dress was clutched in his hands at the time of his death. Panic set in. I decided to return the doll to the shop, but when I went back, the shopkeeper was gone. The store was empty, a Felice sign hanging in the window. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind slipping through a crack in the wall, but soon they grew clearer. "Let me out," a voice hissed. Barely slept, too afraid to close my eyes. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of a shadowy figure standing over me, its hands cold as it touched my face. The next day, I tried to destroy the doll. I threw her into the fireplace, but the flames refused to touch her. I smashed her against the concrete in the garage, but she didn't even crack. "Let me out," the voice repeated, louder now. It wasn't until I saw her smile, her porcelain lips curling ever so slightly, that I realized the truth. She wasn't asking for help. She was toying with me. My house became a prison. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed shut without warning. The doll's whispers followed me everywhere, taunting me. One evening, I found a note scrawled on the mirror in the bathroom, written in what looked like ash. "You can't escape." Desperation drove me to seek help from a paranormal investigator. His name was Vincent, a grizzled man with years of experience in dealing with cursed objects. When he saw the doll, his face darkened. "This isn't just a haunted doll," he said. "It's
a vessel. Something ancient is bound to it, and it won't stop until it's free."
Vincent performed a cleansing ritual, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The doll screamed an ear-piercing, unearthly sound that echoed through the house. But when the ritual ended, the doll was still there, untouched, her expression smug. Vincent looked at me with grim determination. "We need to seal her, bury her somewhere she can never be found." We drove deep into the woods that night, far from civilization. Vincent carried the doll, his hands trembling, despite his efforts to remain calm. We dug a deep hole and placed her inside, covering her with salt and protective talismans before filling the hole with dirt. As we walked away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe easily. But as we reached the car, I froze. Sitting on the hood was the doll, her green dress pristine, her glass eyes shining in the moonlight. She smiled at me. and whispered, "You'll never be rid of me. You'll never be rid."